Right. So I'd like to give a teaching on Assagioli's chapter on the transpersonal self. I find the chapter a bit difficult to read. I have to change my mindset because what he's expressing here is some kind of combination between the work of Carl Jung and the humanistic psychologist. And for those of us who have gone through anything like the kind of suffering, especially imposed by other people or even self-imposed, to talk about Jung and the discovery of archetypes within, or to discuss the vision of Abraham Maslow and self-actualization and self-realization without discussing inner demons. So he mentions Socrates and his daimon, the voice that called him into being, and that to listen to that voice, to respond to the voice, as Assagioli says, as one can infer from the title, requires a great act of will. So he uses here the Buddha as an example. Some people have spontaneous moments of enlightenment where everything is known to them, and what comes out of that is sometimes an unbearable suffering for the world, great compassion for other people, a deep understanding of self and other people, all compressed into an eternal, infinite moment that is barely expressible. I think only expressible, by the way, in literature, art, poetry, etc. And then it can close right down. He says another kind of transcendence, that's what he means by the transpersonal self. You've gotten yourself out of your personality. You've gotten yourself out of, I thought, the idea of taking things personally, as opposed to we live inside the human condition. The transpersonal, I would call the sense of transcendence, the search for inner authenticity. He says the Buddha meditated, I think it was for years, with a willful drive to discover truth. And he had this moment of profound enlightenment. And then he developed practices to maintain that enlightenment. Now, I'm not a Buddhist. I don't really believe in disattachment. I believe in reattachment. I don't believe that the world we live in is illusory. I grew up in a different tradition. But I also know that one thing my tradition does for me is it leads me into a life of depth. So I want to say a few words about that without trying to describe the chapter. When I think of the transpersonal self, I think of going beyond what I'll call the field of consciousness, which ideally, when we're in the proper frame of mind, you've heard me say this before, that we are aware, attuned, accountable, adaptive as a default state. The problem is negative ego states come up and feel and take over the field of consciousness. I call that the ego mind. There has to be some higher self that decides to take those negative ego states, that ego mind, put them back down into the negative ego states of the unconscious ego self. You can't get rid of them, but you can, as it were, domesticate them. You can take them out of active control of your life, and then this higher self reaches over into positive ego states, courage, love, compassion, truth, etc., and as an act of will, brings a different ego state into being in our field of consciousness. So this is not the default field of consciousness of simply being aware, attuned, accountable, adaptive. It's a higher state, where he calls it the unconscious higher self. I just call it the higher self. What he means by that is we're not conscious of it in a continuous way until we decide to be as an act of will. So we draw these other ego states out of potentiality into actuality. And that's part of what self-actualization means. It's a very normative term. Not any part of the self should be actualized. Going back to last week and the week before, you might say the parts of us that are connected to the good, the part of us that are connected to love. And I'll extend that by saying love, justice, truth, and beauty. So the higher self, as it were, the first part of what it means to be an actualized human being in a normative way is for the higher self to draw into the potentialities of what I'll call positive ego states and draw them as dominant field of consciousness, especially when a negative ego state has taken over. Assagioli calls this the psychological rule of substitution. It's an act of will. It's an act of will to go into the higher self. It's an act of will to look into the field of consciousness. It's an act of will to see that a negative ego state has taken over, which means if you can see it, you don't have to be it. If you can name it, you can tame it. You have to train yourself. When I feel that negative ego state, it happens in the body. It happens in thoughts, feelings, emotions, sensations, intuitions. And you train yourself in the higher self to say, that's not good. That is not a life of goodness. I'm not actualizing the potentialities that are aligned with my vision for myself, my highest vision for myself. That comes in. Now, for me, and I think for Assagioli, that's just the foundation of reaching into transcendence. So people who are constantly plagued by negative ego states, whether they're directed outward, such as resentment, anger, a sense of victim, victimizer, or self-attacking. People have voices where they accuse themselves, where they loathe themselves, where they feel guilt and shame. So there's a variety of ego states that can take us off our center. So the first stage is the higher self training the inner life as much as possible to live with ego states aligned with goodness and have them dominate our field of consciousness. I don't think any true sustained inner work can be done if we're not able to do that in a continuous way. Now that takes will, it takes skill, it takes continuous evolving vision, that when you find your field of consciousness has gone to one of the negative ego states, as an act of will and through great skill, you bring the other ones. Now, as a foundation, as it were, one is released from the grip of the Yetzer Hara, and that's the freedom. There's no greater freedom than the higher self freeing oneself from the grip of the Yetzer Hara, destructive forces. That's freedom. Meaning you can be politically free. You can live in the lap of luxury and not be free from the grip of the Yetzer Hara. Now, once one is free from the grip and one has that sense of freedom, is freedom for what? It's freedom to aim toward transcendence. And this is something that's very difficult to talk about because I want to say when I talk about transcendence, when I talk about aligning with the divine, I am saying this with full realization, as we all know from just watching the news this week, there is human evil. There are perpetrators of evil. Horrible things can happen to us. And we go into grief and shock and pain and confusion. And then I look at the awful shooting that happened in Monterey Park. I just read that they reopened the dance hall where the shooting took place, and that it was full. I want us to think about that. What they could have done is made a memorial. Instead, they rededicated themselves to the joy and beauty of people being together and dancing with each other, saying, whatever horror that person inflicted on those people in this community, we're not shutting down a source of light and joy and love in our community with full respect to the victims and the families. We're not giving in to the shadow of other people. We're not giving into evil. When I read about that, I thought the conversation that must have taken place, I don't know who made the decision, but the conversation that took place where they said, again, I'm trusting the news here, we're reopening. See, for me, that is a moment of utter transcendence, coming very deeply from the same place that Jimmy Santiago wrote. They're gonna go into that place of bloodshed and horror, and they're gonna refill it with life, because whatever that person did, they're not gonna drive beauty and joy and human companionship out of the world. That's a transcendent moment. So we find transcendent moments in the particulars of our own life, our own suffering, our own grief, and in the particulars of our life, we try to transcend those particulars with full authenticity, not denying the nature of suffering, not denying the horrible corners of the human condition. With all that in mind, striving for moments of transcendence. And I'll conclude here. One thing that I've noticed with every spiritual tradition I've studied, so putting religion aside, putting philosophy aside, every enlightened spiritual teacher comes down to love, beauty, justice, and truth. Where whatever inventory of our callings to the divine, I don't know of any system that doesn't have at least those four things, and of course many others. So this the transpersonal self for Assagioli means transcending the particulars of one's own existence and not living only in the particulars of one's own existence, but in certain moments transcending into the experience of transcendent values. And I'll add one thing, descending into depth. And that's one thing I so appreciate about this poem. There's something transcendent in the poem, but there's something in the poem where Jimmy Santiago took us down into the depths of his soul, where he found freedom. And he realized nobody can know me but myself when I say, I found beauty here. Now, I understand it. I think most of you understand it. Another person can say, I don't understand that. And he says, because you didn't have to go where I had to go, because it was either give into the prison or find my path to freedom. That's my own personal interpretation. That's not what Assagioli said in the chapter, but it's my takeaway from the chapter. We have one more chapter I want to discuss next week. He calls it the universal will. So he starts out with the strong will, the skillful will, the good will to love, the will for transcendence, and the will to merge into universal consciousness. And that'll be my talk next week.